Let my people go. This is the cry of Moses and the theme of the Exodus story. In the past week, it has been retold many times as part of the observance of Passover in Judaism. For Jewish people living in the diaspora, meaning outside of Israel, Passover is an 8-day celebration commemorating the story of Moses freeing the Israelites from slavery in Egypt some 3 millennia ago. This year, the Passover observance began at sundown on April 22nd and ends at sundown this coming Tuesday, April 30th. Most Passover Seders were observed last Monday and Tuesday evening, and Rona Solomon has kindly volunteered to come up and tell us more about the traditions of the Seder after the sermon, and she'll tell us about the symbolic foods, rituals, and recounting the Moses story of confronting Pharaoh and leading his people out of slavery in Egypt. I've heard from some of you in the fellowship who are Jewish that Passover this year has been difficult, overshadowed by the war between Israel and Hamas, which has triggered xenophobia and anti-Semitism in our own country. The suffering has been horrific. And in that, all of us ask, will there ever be peace in the Middle East? Will there ever be safety and security in this world for Moses' people? Will humanity ever learn how to live with difference, to live side by side as neighbors, peacefully, respectfully? Will we ever learn to transcend our all too human frailties and live hopefully, courageously, rather than fearfully and defensively? I want to express my sorrow for all those observing Passover this year and to all Semitic people who are caught up in the struggle for a peaceful coexistence. In my young adult years, I avoided organized religion and thought the Hebrew and Christian scriptures had no relevance for me in my living. All the begetting and smiting and plagues and sea partings and pillars of salt, well, I had no use for my childhood experience of my grandmother's Pentecostal practice of Christianity. But too many years later, really, in seminary, I learned that there's much more to biblical scripture. I found it full of wisdom and stories that reflect our human nature, our struggle with free will in the face of the human capacity for good as well as evil. And as I would learn, there is no better story for the experience of change and transition. The experience of change and transition by a community of people than the Exodus story. At this time last year, I held up this story as symbolic of transitional ministry. And it is, really. When Reverend Harris retired, the members and friends of this fellowship experienced immediately something akin to crossing the Red Sea, only to be turned out into a wilderness without a clear way to the promised land, and the promised land being a continuing healthy state of congregation with a new minister. Now, I have served as your interim minister, a specialized form of ministry that helps map the way from the Red Sea to the Jordan River. While we have accomplished a great deal, this fellowship, this congregation, has accomplished a great deal in mapping our way or making our way through the wilderness. By now, I had hoped to be a little closer to the Jordan River. Instead, I feel like we are wandering a bit, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. For that reason and more, I want to explore with you today why Moses and his people, why it is that an 11-day trek across the Sinai Peninsula turned out to be 40 years of wandering across the Sinai. Now, of course, I'm not couching the Exodus story in any historical reality. I'm referring to it as a story. But there is a lot of meaning to be found in the symbolic elements of the Exodus story, the story of a community of people who must be willing to go through, not around, a process of transformation before entering the promised land. Now, we might think that Moses and his people were liberated at the moment the Red Sea waters closed around Pharaoh's army. But a state of liberation doesn't gain the people much if it means being a formerly subjugated community suddenly left at loose ends. At that point in the story, the land of milk and honey is not a clear vision embraced by Moses' people. The people also were painfully aware of their new wilderness environment as a very uncomfortable place to be. The food was bad, the manna dry and tasteless. There was a constant shortage of water, and Moses would disappear for days at a time. How did they know he would return? They decided to pray to the old gods for protection, and thus did the golden calf get cast, if you're familiar with that part of the Exodus story. Now, biblical scholars see in the meandering way the God of Israel dispatches Moses and his people, they say that the Israelites are at first ambivalent about the movement to freedom, which points to the very real challenges with journeying. There's anxiety and uncertainty. And the parallels in contemporary life seem to be that in our human nature, many people face a reluctance to try something new, to explore uncharted territory, to leave one's comfort zone, to travel a less familiar and comfortable path. In his blog, Rabbi Corey Helfand says, as we learn in the Talmud, there is a long way which is short, and a short way which is long. The journey of the Jewish people through the wilderness from slavery to freedom is undoubtedly filled with trials and tribulations, yet ultimately through our circuitous route, Helfand says, we become a unified nation, a people of Israel, stronger from our experiences, more mature through our overcoming adversity, and eventually more assured that leaving Egypt was in fact the right thing to do. So if our fellowship is not in proximity to the metaphorical land of milk and honey, perhaps we just need more time, more experience, more being in relationship with one another under some kind of stressful, stressful conditions. So the God of Israel, in the God of Israel's wisdom, thought that a bit more wandering and a more circuitous route is not a bad thing. And I do believe that there are two factors at work in the fellowship, which, even in taking more time and a more circuitous route, I want to hold up as stumbling blocks. And those two things are conflict avoidance and fear of the unknown. For example, in the Exodus story, as Moses and his people near the land of Canaan, Moses calls to Israel's tribes to appoint spies who will go out and scout the land of Israel. 10 of the spies returned to describe the land as flowing with milk and honey, but they also warned the people of the dangers that lie ahead, sure that Israel will not have the capacity to conquer the land. Speaking with certainty, they spread fear among the people. And there is a temptation to go back to where they had come from, because they were afraid. They were a bit panicked. And they said out loud, "Why does the Lord bring us to this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be as spoils. Is it not better for us to return to Egypt?" Now, this fear of the unknown and people's lack of confidence in themselves and their leaders, that led to that feeling of nostalgia, and perhaps a nostalgia misremembered. But that longing is totally understandable. It is a all too human trait to choose comforts and certainties of the past over uncertainties of the future. And Rabbi Yonatan Cohen states in his blog, "It takes courage to face the unknown and wisdom to withstand the temptations of an imperfect, irretrievable past." Well, as we know from the story, as soon as we want to go back to Egypt leaves the lips of Moses' people, the God of Israel loses patience and threatens to smite them all. But Moses incredibly talks the God of Israel out of it. But there's a consequence in trying to avoid conflict and retreat to the past. The God of Israel decides there will be no memories of Egypt carried into the promised land, and so Moses and his generation are fated to wander the Sinai for the next 40 years. And they will die before reaching the River Jordan. And while it seems a harsh judgment, the wisdom here is that liberation requires transformation. You're not truly free. You're not truly free to enter into a different way of being without being willing to be transformed in the process. Now, I'm not saying that fear of the unknown and conflict avoidance come with a death sentence. But there is a yes and no in that. All people, all communities, all institutions, all living biological systems perpetually cycle through stasis, change, chaos, stasis. And all systems will resist change. But without change, a system that remains in stasis too long will die out. And this is a condition of living at every level in this biosphere, and it is part of our human condition. We must abide change. There are no guarantees in life. We must do the best we can to take it in our stride. And that can be very difficult and challenging at times. As a community of people, as a fellowship and a congregation, we are in the big middle of change, not only with respect to the transitional or interim ministry that we're working through together, but also with respect to our larger national identity, as Bill said earlier, as a member congregation of the Unitarian Universalist Association. That's a lot of change. And when we layer over having just been through COVID and the unsettling events and conditions on a global scale, we're dealing with so much, it's almost too much. So let me leave you with this today. Let's slow down, take the time that we need to work through this transformation. Let's do what we can to muster courage and have confidence in ourselves that we have the capacity to handle conflict and the discomfort of being in the wilderness of change for a while. Let us remember our congregational covenant to seek the truth in love, in right relationship, even when the stakes seem high and we don't all agree on how to get to the promised land. And finally, let us be inspired by this year's Passover observance and Exodus story. We will get to the River Jordan together, alive, and in one piece. And I hope with all my heart it may be so. So let me at this time invite Rona up to tell us about the Passover Seder.
Good morning. Good morning. So, let's see how far I get with visual aids. This might be not doing that. Hold on. Let's see. Okay. All right. So, Passover. Passover is an experiential holiday. At the Passover Seder, which is a home ritual based around a meal, guests not only have a chance to hear the story of the Exodus from Egypt, but through symbolic Passover foods and the discussions that they provoke, we get to experience slavery and liberation and empathize with people still yearning for freedom. The word Seder means order. In modern Hebrew, kol beseder means it's okay. What's up? Kol beseder, everything's in order. The Haggadah, which literally means telling or retelling, is the liturgy and the user guide for the Passover Seder. It was written over the course of 1,000 years, starting in the 2nd century, and finally by the 12th century it reached the form that we can probably all recognize, with 4 questions, with poems, with songs at the end. And it's still a work in progress, and so each of us adds our own story to the Seders that we attend. The template for the ritual meal is laid out in the 4 questions, which are questions traditionally asked by the youngest guest at the Seder. I was the youngest guest for 4 years until my cousin Michelle was born, and then she was the youngest guest. What is different about this night? Manishtana halayla hazeh. Why do we eat matzah? Why do we eat bitter herbs? Why do we dip food in salt water and in horosis? And finally, why do we recline around the table? The answer to these questions is that we, all of us, were slaves, and the Lord God redeemed us with a mighty hand. So, whether you hear that as being freed from ancient captivity thousands of years ago by a God who can make miracles, or if you hear that as you and me gaining freedom from our own personal captivity with the help of a higher power or inner strength or the support of our friends, is up to you. But what we can all agree on is that there's a lot of liberation work left to do personally, together, and in society. So, now we get to the hard part, the visual aids. So, where does this need to be?
More in the center.
Okay, I'm gonna get steps in there. So, why on this night do we eat matzah? Matzah is unleavened bread. Matzah tells the story, starts the story of leaving in haste. The Hebrew slaves needed to flee immediately. We could not wait for the bread to rise. Just like we need to leave our bondage behind quickly. We need to rip off the bandage. So on the table is a stack of 3 matzot, which represent the Jewish people. During the Seder, the middle matzah is split in 2, and one half, the afikomen, I knew this was going to be too hard. Hold on. One half, the afikomen, is hidden, later to be found and redeemed. Maybe that would be better, but I have to hold this too. So here we go. I can try the handheld mic. That would be good. Okay. Afikomen, which is the name for this half matzah, is Greek for dessert. And we need it in order to finish the meal. It represents, perfect, that's so good. Great. Okay. The hidden afikomen symbolizes the captivity of the Jews in Egypt, in many lands afterwards where Jews were a stateless people, in pogrom-ridden Europe, in ghettos around the world, during the Inquisition and the Holocaust. Later in the Seder, this is going to be redeemed. The ransom, which in my day was a silver dollar for each child, will be willingly paid. During the 1960s, and until the fall of the Soviet Union, a 4th matzah was added to remember the plight of the Jews in the Soviet Union. Bitter herbs. Why bitter herbs? Bitter herbs leave the taste of suffering, the suffering of slavery, in our mouths. Salt water. I know, I could have done better on this. NaCl. Salt water. Salt water flavors even the tastiest of foods with the tears of slaves. The 2 foods that are dipped in salt water are parsley and an egg. The parsley symbolizes spring, of course, but also the offspring of the Hebrews in Egypt. One of the cruelest things that Pharaoh did was order the male Hebrew children to be drowned in the salt water of the Nile Delta. The egg? Spring, of course, but a rebirth that's salted with tears. So haroset. Haroset is pretty delicious. It's a mixture of fruit and nuts and wine and a little bitter herbs, but it symbolizes Pharaoh's cruel order to make adobe bricks without straw. If you didn't meet your quota of bricks for the day, you could be beaten, you could be whipped, you could be killed. You remember the story of Moses leaving Egypt. He left after killing a guard who was beating a slave for not making enough bricks. And so It's very good. Okay. And of course, we recline. We recline in our seats because we're now free, or at least we now have the ability to act as if we're free. So not in the 4 questions are 2 inedible foods that remind guests of the sacrifices common in the days of the temple: a roasted lamb bone and a roasted egg. Passover is one of 3 agricultural sacrifice holidays when everyone, for example, Jesus and his followers, would head to the temple for sacrifices. Vegans can substitute a blood red beet for the lamb and a baby eggplant for the egg. What sacrifices are we willing to make? So the Haggadah is an evolving document, and the Seder makes way for new concerns each year. For example, this year many people have added an empty chair to express the longing that Hamas release the remaining hostages or release their remains. And olives, which have been on the table for a number of years now, representing the fervent wish for peace in the Middle East, to an end to war and an end to the occupation in Palestine. Additions to the Seder plate can be items that remind guests of their own liberation stories. Okay. For the last 40 years, a crust of bread or an orange is found on many Seder plates. Susanna Heschel at Oberlin originated this tradition, saying that there was as much room for a lesbian in Judaism as for bread on the Seder plate. The bread is given way to an orange whose many segments represent the inclusion of women and LGBTQIA people. It's a two-handed, because the orange opens segments. Stay. Or not. Or not. Coffee, chocolate, or a tomato remind guests that people, field workers, migrant workers, children. Oh.
Let me hold the mic while you do this.
Okay, thank you. That's so much better. Continue to toil in the fields like we did when we were slaves, and that often it's their forced labor that puts food on our plates. This is a call to action. Airlifts of Ethiopian Jews to Israel saved their lives, but they were starving and in such bad shape that they could only tolerate eating mashed potatoes until they were strong enough for protein. The potato reminds us of their modern-day exodus. During the war in Iraq, cashews reminded us about troops far away in the desert, in a war not of their own choosing. The salty nuts reminded us of the desert and the danger. I think we can all remember the photos of 3-year-old Elon Kurdi and his 5-year-old brother Galip washing ashore in Europe, drowned. With their tragic deaths, the world woke up to the enormous but human scale of suffering for Syrian refugees. Their dad said they loved bananas, and every day that he could manage it, he would bring home a banana for the boys to share. A banana on the Seder plate not only honors little Elon and Galip, but it raises our awareness about refugees and displaced people around the globe today. Acorns find their way to some tables to remind guests that we're celebrating our liberation on land stolen from indigenous people. Toward the end of the Seder, a cup of wine is poured for Elijah, and the haunting tune, Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, is sung, and the door opened for the prophet, and all of the guests say in unison, "May all who are hungry come and eat." These actions represent our longing for a messianic era of world peace and an end to hunger. Also, the parents always drink the wine. It's like Santa's cookies. Now, along with Elijah's cup, we honor women with Miriam's cup. This cup, filled with water from each guest, recognizes the role women played in the Exodus and also the continuing responsibility that women around the world take to provide water for their communities. Watch this, the white thing's going to show up on the orange. So cute. Okay. So, happy holiday, Chag Sameach. May all beings be liberated, and may we all help make it so.
Rona, thank you. I love your Seder. What will our liberation story be? I want to suggest that there is no way of knowing that right now. So please lean in to uncertainty. Please lean in to discomfort. Please lean in, period. Thank you.